Right, I would have been in OWASP Manchester because they have event exactly the same time. But I've been 2 days here in the conference an exhibition down at Olympia. So I've had 2 days of talking to lots of people and sharing the goodness of SBOMs. So this talk is entitled How SBOMs Can Help You. When I gave this talk in Manchester last June, come on, why is that not working? I said they will help. That was June. I think they are now. We've moved forward in 9 months to now seeing SBOMs actually getting valuable and starting to see people starting to see the traction that SBOMs can give you. Bit about me. I started a long time ago in this industry when everyone's software was written proprietary by the team that delivered it. And I've worked in what you might call OT and defense. Big projects that take a long time to finish, never finish really. And the software is constantly evolving slowly. Lots of process. I sort of retired so I could start writing open source software again, officially. And then someone said, you've got quite a lot of open source software. Let's try and make a business. So I set up a business, which is APH10, and I'm trying to sell software risk and the software supply chain, a business around that and how to make that more secure. Because if you think about it, it's a big challenge. Software's everywhere. To some extent, software's out of control in some areas. So let's try and make a business out of that. I like sharing as well. So for the last 10 years, I've been going around schools as a STEM ambassador, telling them the joys of what engineering is and software and technology and why maths is good. It's obviously worked because both my sons are now in systems and computer teaching. So that's obviously worked. I also mentor. I mentor students. I'm a mentor for the Google Summer of Code, which is just about going through the current final stages of selecting the projects this year. And I teach coding to Coder Dojo. And that's where the joy of Python sort of came from. That is not an OWASP, that's a Manchester B. So if you go to Manchester, Manchester has something called the Digital Security Hub, which was set up to try and be an ecosystem for the cyber in the northwest. Great thing, set up about middle of 2022, runs a load of startup programs, great network. So everyone shows the Manchester B, which comes from a few years ago where everyone became very associated with the B. Bees work hard. That's what Manch unions do. And I also have a life of running. So that's what I might be doing later, running to the train. Who remembers Log4Shell? Who's still suffering? That's good. Did you enjoy that as well? So did you handle this utility better than you did Log4Shell in 2021? Or was it really a problem? So how many went, yippee, XZ, not a problem? Not many of you. That's brave. Well done. I think most people are like that. That's the way most engineering managers are, most devs. It's not going to affect us really, is it? But your customer wants to know. And when we get celebrity vulnerabilities, the media get hold of it and then starts doom and gloom. And your CISO gets a bit iffy and says, right, where are we? We need to be better. And if you think about software, certainly in my career, software's just got more and more complex. Gone are the days where one engineer could understand a full application suite. Nobody understands all the software, how it all comes together. You've got different applications, infrastructure guys, app guys, etc. And that's bringing risk. This is what I'll call the Rumsfeld things, the unknown unknowns. How do you know the risk that you have got as a business if you're delivering your software to your customers? If you don't know what's in your software, because we all know software is not perfect. Or maybe you all like perfect software, but I've never found that. So if you don't know the risk, how can you answer the question, are we affected by any of these vulnerabilities? So you all now go, it's all about software bill of materials. Hopefully, most of you have probably heard of software bill of materials. But if you've not, I'll use my analogy. We all have some food. You go to a restaurant, what's the first thing you ever ask? Have you got any allergies? And they're trying to protect themselves, because we know if you had an allergy and you didn't know, they didn't know about it, you could have a bad allergic reaction, and we don't want the consequences of that. But if you actually look at a burger, that's where a burger really comes from. It's got lots of suppliers. Beef's come from where? Maybe they've built their own, grown their own vegetables, maybe made their own buns. But there's a load of people involved creating that product. And hopefully that product is fresh. So the food has probably got a sell-by date. And actually, when you go to a burger, my son won't have the tomatoes, but we'll have different configurations of that burger. Shift that to software. You all have product configurations, different settings, maybe for different customers. What's the sell-by date? That's your vendor support or end of life. All the suppliers that they've got, do you know where they're coming from? Do you know exactly what that chain is? So if that chain got disrupted, you would know, you might have an alternative supplier. So if the beef didn't come from wherever, they would know they could get somewhere else. Can you do that with your software? So SBOM is formal. It's not to be kept in a locked cabinet, just as a PDF printed off and never read. The big thing about SBOMs is this information is captured by your maybe build team, but shared within your organization, because your organization will get different values depending on what they're looking for, whether it's the governance people, whether it's the product people, whether it's the dev people. And it's all about risk. It's not about technical, it's about your risk, that your software that you have built through your building blocks are potentially exposing your business to. There's been a lot of actions. So we all remember SolarWinds. If you notice, there's a little bit of a pattern. Generally, you tend to find these big vulnerabilities happen just before Christmas. You're going to see that later on. Hopefully, we'll see another slide. So there's been consultations. SolarWinds then upset. The US government got a little bit concerned, so they said we need to look at the software supply chain. They came up with something called the US Exec Order, Order 14228, May 2021, a landmark in software supply chain security. And that came up with we need to be more transparent with all our software. And what they also came up with is, in the same way we have like EPC ratings for houses and energy ratings for your white goods, they wanted to have an EPC rating for software. I don't think that's there yet, but it's a nice idea. So you can compare software. Then Log4j happened. If people had had SBOMs and all the tooling that we need now for Log4j, people would not have spent the thousands of hours trying to find out whether they're affected. So I think the 9th of December 2021 is the day the software world realized we need to do things differently. Then Linux Foundation came up with a report to say, are we ready for this SBOM thing now? We've seen the exec order, ish. So then OpenSSF then came up with 10 work streams and quite a bit of funding from some of the big tech companies in the US, starting to look at how we improve the software supply chain, the tooling, the processes, etc. And one of them was called SBOM Everywhere, which is all about education and maybe tooling to support the process. The one challenge, I think, is people got a message that SBOMs just had to be generated. Nobody thought about how they were to be used. And that is where I think we really need to focus on. Generation is relatively easy. Generation and understanding them is a bit harder. Europe then got in the act, Cyber Resilience Act. In normal EU things, it's taken a while, but they want to do exactly the same. Any software-based product needs to have this transparency. That's quite a big change for anyone, any business selling into Europe. Think of it as CE marking for software. And there's a whole lot of things. You can have a completely different talk all about COA. Plenty of people in Europe are making a lot of noise about what that means in terms of process. UK then sort of did a consultation early 2023. Really say, should we be doing something similar? Their summary was, maybe. Personally, I think, why wouldn't we? They came up, maybe some industries, sectors may benefit. Vulnerabilities don't care what sector it is, it's a vulnerability. Log4Shell in finance, Log4Shell in retail, Log4Shell in defense, it's the same thing, it's a problem. So we should be practicing it. What's probably more important is the medical device market in the States and the Federal Drug Agency. For any medical device now sold in the US market, has to have this software transparency, has to have a software bill of materials available, has to declare any vulnerabilities that are available when it releases the product. You speak to medical device markets, most people never really knew what the software was, not to the depth that's now required. They didn't want to reveal that. So feel that's where we have to. And then the COA, I think, may get, depends on the EU elections, which I've lost track of when that is now. That might become statute middle of the year. 3 years, 2027, it will be law. So there will be a transition period about things, but actually there will be significant number of processes and guidelines required that software organizations will have to do, or their products will have to go through. So it's quite a lot, there's quite a lot of work potentially, I think, from where we are now to where you need to get to. Right, two standards. One's from the OWASP world, was released earlier, updated 2 weeks ago. And it introduced some further things. And you'll see the slide later on about what it covers. But it's really going to try and provide an awful lot more of documentation about your software and its components. Really great. SPDX announced their version, updated version, on Tuesday. I haven't looked at it in detail, but I know it doesn't cover some of the stuff that Cyclone DX currently has in 1.6. They haven't got everything done. They've broken components down to in a slightly different way. Both are standards. Shame we've got two, but they're there. Use them. But basically, they're the same. You have metadata, you have components, you have relationships. Relationships are quite important. That's where you find A is dependent on B, is dependent on C, is dependent on D. Really important. And that's where I think a lot of value that people have never had before suddenly comes apparent. And you're all practicing the secure development lifecycle, aren't you? So you're doing all these checks all the time. Maybe. Sometimes. I run dev teams and I wouldn't let them use any third-party software unless I could say, is it licensed, is it tested, is it maintained? It's really hard to govern that if everyone's just freely downloading stuff from GitHub. But you should be doing this. You need to know what's going in there as dev teams, dev managers. You need the oversight. So SBOMs are not just for devs. SBOMs should all be for the security team, the governance team. And I have a mantra, if you generate it, you should use it. Because the information that your dev team provides, the governance team will find the value. What license are you using, for example? That might be a very interesting question. Does it line up with our corporate policy about third-party licenses? And I see a supply chain there from developers through a supplier, through integrators to an end user. But that's incremental, isn't it? just move it along. You continue, you're always at, you know, the end user is always just the next one on the chain. Cyclone DX has a huge tool set, which is really good. Mixture of open source and proprietary. I've got a few tools on there. It's continually growing. But this is the lifecycle I suggest that you use for SBOMs. Generates the starts. So maybe you get your build team, your pipeline, your CI/CD comes out of your build. Then you should start looking at what's inside. I think you might be surprised what you find. Really valuable some stuff. I'll show you some of the things I found when I did a study a few months ago. And then that should tell you what you're going to prioritize. You're going to find problems, then you need to prioritize those problems. You're not going to fix them all, so prioritize them. And then you go remediate, and then you go around again, because it's continual. Your baseline's continually changing. And Mr. CISO is probably quite happy because he's got control, he's got oversight. The SolarWinds CISO has been taken to court, the SEC has taken to court because his process wasn't being followed. Any CISOs in the room, are you worried? Are your processes being followed by your dev team? Let's try and help. Because you don't want this. This is a classic and I've seen every variance of this because there was one for the XZ utils. Yes, change the text, it's still the same message. There's a bit of component that everybody relies on. If it goes AWOL, what happens? Do you know what that piece of code is? Do you know all your suppliers, all the way down your supply chain? What happened if that broke? How would you fix it? You'd be surprised what some of the software that everyone's got in, they know, and how it's been maintained. A lot of that's open source by volunteers. For every business worked out what that piece of open source software that's been maintained by a developer out of the freedom of his heart because he likes doing software for fun, just give him $5,000 to keep him happy. He'd be delighted, but it's good value. So some of the insights I've shown, and then they're going to show some further things, and I'm going to have to bomb along because I'm looking at the time. Right. Some of the things you're going to find, if you've got SBOMs, you don't have one SBOM, you have a whole suite of SBOMs. Have you got multiple versions of the same component across different builds, different applications? That could be proprietary or it could be open source. What does that mean? Are you maintaining them different versions? Could be good reasons. Are they being, can you say whether each component is actively being maintained? Can you look at that? Can you see when it was last updated? It's not been updated for a couple of years. That might be an indication the maintainer might have got other things he'd rather be doing. Are any of those components vulnerable to you? And how does that vulnerability affect you? Does it affect you? Are you supporting your suppliers and your communities? Think of OWASP. That might be a good example. Are you supporting the OWASP, the great work the OWASP does? Licenses, open source licenses. I find UK, we're not quite as strict as in the way we use open source licenses as Europe is. But actually, if you use the licenses the wrong way, then potentially that makes your commercial product potentially not viable if you've used the wrong software licenses. So are you checking them before it becomes too late? I know some companies trying to go through a merger and M&A. They started looking at this and they said, I'm not acquiring this because this won't fit in my tech stack because the licenses are incompatible. Ultimately, I want to improve your security and I want to improve your resilience. So some of the things I found is nothing in an SBOM currently says what the environment is. So I do Python. There's nothing in the SBOM standards, even the updated ones, that say it's Python, it's running on Ubuntu, what versions? Fortunately, Cyclone DX from OWASP allows you to do user-defined properties, which is what I do. SPDX is a bit harder. What I also found, most open source projects will target multiple versions of a language. Python's got 5 versions currently. If I built for each version, I got a different build, different set of dependencies. How are you capturing that? So if you do the same probably say for Java, probably you get similar. What I've found is later versions of languages had few dependencies. That's probably a good idea to say, are you up to date? Transitive dependencies are the hidden dependencies. They tend to change more frequently than what I've noted with the direct ones, but that was just my application. Licenses, there's something called SPDX license identifiers. There's an official license identifier for every license, and there's about 300 or 400 licenses. Apache 2 is Apache-2.0, not Apache space 2. So if any of you look at open source software, look at the license. Can you make sure, put a simple pull request in to make the license correct? That will make my life so much simpler. SBOM quality, there's lots of quality tools. I wrote one of them. SBOM quality is a variable feast. What's good? What does good look like? So the NTIA one is a minimum standard that the US government identified as what an SBOM component should have in it. The scorecard eBay came up with, I don't know why eBay did it, but it was just a useful idea, just a viewpoint. There's a benchmark one looking at quality, look at the enrichment of data, an audit I just look and say, are you using the latest version of the software? And that's an example of different things. These are all open source projects, I think, all generating SBOMs, and there's a this website assesses them. Go and look who the top one. And then there's another thing is I built applications into a clean virtual machine to make sure I was getting the latest versions of all the software. And then I found I wasn't. That's because the developers had pinned the dependencies. I didn't find, that was nothing anything in the documentation, anything in the SBOM. It's only when I started analyzing it, I find that. That was a real eye-opener. There's a story behind that, which I won't be able to share, but another day. But what it's saying is metadata is really important to, as a community, please help the metadata get better. Data enrichment, I want people to put as much data in their SBOMs as possible, because the more data in there, the more value people are going to get from it, and the more different users are going to get useful information. Then looking at how your components change. And this one was a really good one. I presented this at FOSDEM a few months ago. And the top one is just the number of dependencies that changed over time, over 12 months. You know, we were adding new features and various things were coming in. So you'd expect a few more dependencies come in. The bottom line is the red things, which are the number of components to change per week. And what we noticed is there's 3 peaks. First peak is around Easter. Second peak was the start of the European holidays, the end of July. And the third peak was Thanksgiving Day. What does that show you about open source maintenance? They tend to do maintenance at holiday time. So that could be a strength, it could be a weakness, because that means maybe there's a load of people put dodgy defects at holiday time as well. But that was a really interesting insight that I only got because I analyzed a year's worth of SBOMs for the same build. And this was just as a way of just showing how quickly some components were changing every week. Some components were changing things. What we noticed when we looked at it, most of the changes were feature-led, not security-led. Devs like doing new features. They don't like fixing bugs, was basically the conclusion. And when I started looking at old age of the last update, some of these were more than 2 years old. Again, that was quite useful, because what that highlighted was we were using an old version of a component that it actually was now included in the Python libraries, and we missed that. So this was quite a useful way of capturing that. Right, I said I'd tell you what some of the things that have happened in CycloneDX 1.6 that got released last week. Software doesn't live on its own. Software lives on hardware. So there's a hardware bomb. Software generally supports services. So you have software as a service, which delivers your APIs that you're using. So Cyclone DX includes this enrichment. What he added last week was crypto bombs, SBOMs, which identifies which cryptos you're using in your services. And that's quite useful, is if you look at, a lot of components support many different versions of the cryptos. Documenting which ones you're using will then, when you're doing your vulnerability analysis, will work out, well, am I affected? Well, we're using this, and I'm not a crypto expert. So using crypto X, and if you said you looked in your SBOM, which has a CBOM in it, then, and we're not using that crypto, then we're not affected by the vulnerability. Great visibility. Removes, you answer that question, you're happy days. Of course, it's got ML bombs for the AI. So that's documenting your data that's gone into your training model, what type of model it, what's the pedigree, which model it's come from. But it's also added energy consumption, which is interesting. I was talking to someone this afternoon. You look at AI models, they are potentially quite big consumers of energy. Are you aware of that? So that's maybe other things. And I know SPDX is also looking at that same thing. And they're future ones looking at manufacturing and architecture. OBOM, I'm a system of systems person. So it's really another SBOM. So it's a system of systems. And I believe people like Lockheed Martin, who are a great supporter of OWASP, have an SBOM, all the bombs, all the way down for an F-35. All the way down. So that'll include traditional bill of materials for all widgets and all the electronics, but just for all the software, and that must be thousands of bill of materials. And SBOMs don't live on their own. So generally, you've got some security. Salsas comes from the Linux Foundation. We won't talk about that. That's a supply chain thing. The one thing I want to talk about is VEX. Vulnerabilities happen. How do you share whether those vulnerabilities are false positives or not? So if you look at traditionally, when you build a system, how many devs will clear a system that has no vulnerabilities? Show of hands. That's correct. No one will deliver vulnerable-free code. You can't. It's too big. But most of those vulnerabilities are not material to your application because the vulnerability doesn't apply to the way your context. So how do you share that? VEX is a way of sharing that context. It says, we've assessed it, we are not affected. We've got countermeasures. We've got, basically, we're not using that version of that function of the library that's vulnerable. So what's the VEX? VEXs will be issued continually between your baselines. You need to assess each vulnerability and document that in a VEX and share that with your downstream. And you should be being shared from your upstream, should be passing this to you. Fortunately, there are 4 standards. We had 2 standards for SBOMs, now we've got 4. CSAF, which has come from OASIS, which is Cisco have heavily been involved. Cyclone DX has had it. OpenVex is a very simple one that's come from the Linux Foundation, and SPDX now has one that got released on Tuesday, and I haven't looked at it in detail. I was aware of some of the early developments. That's a real shame. One of the things we've also identified is what I'll call the EOX, end of life, end of support day. How do we document that with this component is now end of support and we're no longer going to update it? There is no agreed way of doing that. There is currently a standard being developed. So let's keep track of that. That will be really useful information. When you deliver a baseline software in an SBOM, you probably don't know when this end of support is going to be. I've written a library called lib4vex, which I shared with CISA, which is US government, earlier this month, which tries to abstract that on a very, very simple use case. So I look forward to basically, if people want to look at that and support it, it needs a home. I don't know where it'll end. At the moment, it's under my GitHub, but it will go. I want it to go somewhere. and I'll update it for SPDX. So if people want to think about this, more than happy to share more with you. So conclusions, and I've got -2 minutes. SBOMs are valuable. Start using them. Even if you're not asked to use them, start using them because I think you'll get some value. Talk to your suppliers. Ask them. When you're doing your checklists, you know, to audit, are they doing SBOMs? Ask them. And if they don't know what an SBOM is, you might know someone who might be able to educate them. If they are producing them, I would encourage you to get them to produce them in both formats. They all have strengths and weaknesses. If you want to maximize your data value, get them in both formats. Share them. I'm conscious that people get very careful about, well, someone could say, well, I've got that component, so therefore I'm going to be under threat. Well, you've already done threat modeling, haven't you? So you know what your threat position is. And the hackers can already reverse engineer your code anyway. So it's not anything new. But actually, it may rise up, might have profile about, oh, we've got this amount of technical debt internally. So it might actually be a good communication thing to get some more investment. And also, suppliers, be realistic. Don't expect to have to zero vulnerabilities. That's not viable. Think about maybe a more risk-based approach rather than just a severity approach. And regulations coming. So this is going to change. I think we've had quite an easy life for the last 10 years in software. Processes become a little bit lax. This is where we've got to do. There's some books. That one's by a very good lady, Cassie, who is a VP of product security for Schneider Electric, the supply chain across the world. How does she manage that? Tom is one of the chapter leads of OWASP SBOM Forum, which I'm part of, and I've helped write that book. So if you're interested in that, it's available in various formats, including Amazon. And if you want to hear me again, that's my original talk I gave 9 months ago, so you can see how much has changed. There's a whole load of talks at FOSDEM. There's 8 hours of FOSDEM talks about SBOMs, standards, experiences, futures. And that's another one I gave a few months ago about more to the commercial world, the non-techie world. Remember, SBOMs need data. Help, please. And that's Manchester B. That's me. Okay, thank you very much.